Hey, Laszlo Montgomery here. Just a quick word before the episode. This one you're about to hear has been out on Patreon and CHP Premium for a while now. This and hours of new stuff that I've been working on since last year are available there, and all this new CHP material will be coming out later this year. But for now, still a work in progress. Come see what you've been missing and relieve yourself of that FOMO. Thanks, everyone. Hey everyone, welcome back. Laszlo Montgomery again. Thanks for making time for me at this hour. You're listening to the China History Podcast. 16 years young, come June 2026. Who would have ever thought? I forgot who brought this topic to my attention. Maybe it was no one. But I was thinking, this would be a good story that we could all enjoy. And up till now, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think I've ever showcased New Zealand in the CHP. And this country is front and center in what I have to present to you today. This will be a short episode. Today I wanted to mention about the 19th century experiences of Chinese New Zealanders and the lead up to the events surrounding the tragedy of the sinking of the SS Ventnor in 1902. After so many CHP episodes, we all know what kind of condition the Chinese nation was in following the commencement of the Century of Humiliation. The 1850s and 60s were among the worst years the Chinese people had seen since the fall of the Ming Dynasty in 1644. The Taiping Rebellion, the Nian Rebellion, the Bunti Hakka Wars, and all the extra stress overpopulation had caused, especially in the south of China. That's what mainly caused this epic mass exodus from China to the gold mines and railroads of America, to Canada, the Caribbean, Europe, India, Africa, and to all the major ports of Southeast Asia and elsewhere. There have been stories, movies, and theatrical works that have taught us about that time. In past CHP episodes, we've looked at a lot of the stories and the everyday heroes who emerged in Chinese immigrant history, especially in the U.S. It doesn't get the attention that it should, but the same old stories that we're familiar with in North America were also played out in Australia and New Zealand. January 1848, gold was discovered in Sutter's Mill. That marked the start of the California Gold Rush. 1849 to 1852 were the peak years. Up in Canada, the Fraser Canyon Gold Rush of 1858 to 1860 and the Caribou Gold Rush of 1861 to 1867 brought thousands and thousands of Chinese to the Great White North. And over in Australia, from 1851 to 1858, plenty of gold was being mined in Bathurst and New South Wales, Ballarat and Bendigo and Victoria. And then from 1861 to 1867, came the Otago Gold Rush in New Zealand, and that's what we're going to look at today. No matter where in the world Chinese migrated to in the mid-19th century, every country had their earliest pioneer heroes. In the USA, we recall Norman Ah Sing, Wong Ching Fu, Chin Gei He, and many more. In New Zealand, they had Choie Sew Hoy, or Xu Zhao Kai in Mandarin. Choie Sew Hoy's date of birth is not known for certain, but I'm going to go with 1836. So he was perfectly slotted in life to become part of that massive migration during the second half of the 19th century. He came from Panyu County, where the ancient history of Guangzhou began. Choie Sew Hoy sure got around. He participated in the California Gold Rush, and after that he got in on the Australian Gold Rush in Victoria. Choie Sew Hoy, he was too smart and entrepreneurial to engage in the backbreaking labor of mining. Plus, he spoke English, the great differentiator that separated the coolie labor from the ones who made their living as a merchant or liaising with the locals. Choie Sew Hoy made a living by employing one of the most important and ancient skill sets known to humankind, buying and selling. He set up a shop that sold all the necessities of life to the Chinese community and to other local peoples, of course. And he got into other businesses and ran several mines on his own account. He also provided services to wherever a need arose among the New Zealand mining community. And because he was who he was, those Chinese who knew Choie Sew Hoy or knew of him, they deferred to him and respected him. He married a woman named Eliza Prescott, and they had 2 children together. New Zealand history didn't record Choie Sew Hoy as the first Chinese to come to New Zealand. That honor went to a man named Wang He Ting, or Wang Apu Hukton. He showed up in the town of Nelson back in 1842. That's the northern coast of the South Island on the Tasman Sea. He didn't come for the gold, which hadn't been discovered yet. Like most young Chinese in his position, he was a cabin boy or steward on a merchant ship. But he did well for himself, investing in real estate, starting businesses, and according to his bio, lived to 100, dying in 1920. Just like California's boom towns along the Mother Lode that ran along the Sierra foothills from Mariposa to Placer counties, New Zealand too had its center where most of the action took place, and this was in Otago. Otago. That's where our story took place. Well, most of it anyway. This is where the Chinese came. It was more than just the name of the second biggest region in all of New Zealand. Captain James Cook first saw it in 1770. Like everywhere in New Zealand, its name is derived from the Maori word for the place, and I'm guessing they don't pronounce it Otago. Outside of Wellington and Auckland, more Chinese ended up there than anywhere else. If you look on a map of New Zealand, it occupies the southernmost part of the South Island. The largest city was Dunedin, which was sort of like the San Francisco of Otago. At about 46 degrees south, Dunedin is one of the southernmost sizable cities on the planet. It's similar in latitude to Patagonia in southernmost South America. They found gold first in Gabriel's Gully on May 25, 1861, and this attracted almost 20,000 European and Australian gold diggers to Otago. 4 years into the gold rush in 1865, Choie Sew Hoy picked up, left Australia, and moved to New Zealand to get in on all that excitement. Again, he didn't get his hands dirty out in the mountains and rivers. He had higher ambitions and the smarts to get in on other, more lucrative opportunities. Like he had done in Australia, he was a merchant to the trade. English, Irish, and of course Australian miners thought they had picked the mines of Otago clean of gold. And then gold was discovered on the northwest side of the island, so they picked up and moved there. And almost overnight, Hokitika, New Zealand became the latest in a long line of mid-19th century boom towns. Watching in despair as practically their whole economy migrated to the northwest of the island, the Otago Provincial Council and Dunedin Chamber of Commerce sent out the call to the Chinese community and welcomed them to come mine for whatever the Europeans had given up on. After all, the Chinese miners had earned a good reputation in Australia and were considered suitable enough and disciplined enough to rework these abandoned claims that the European miners considered worked out. There was also a belief that these Chinese miners were temporary and would eventually go home rather than settle permanently in New Zealand. 1865, 1866, they started coming. San Francisco was called Jiujinshan, Old Gold Mountain. New Zealand was called New Gold Mountain. At first there were maybe about a dozen guys. It always started out that way. These fearless pioneers came and got a first look and took in the lay of the land and sent word back to their people about the prospects. That's all it took usually. By 1869, there were around 1,200. During the peak years, late 1860s and into the 1870s, that number jumped to 4,700, with 1878 witnessing the peak of Chinese immigration in New Zealand. About 5,000 Chinese. In that year, New Zealand was gripped by economic depression, and the relations between the Crown and its Maori population was in a bad place. Things were brewing in Parihaka, where the largest Maori settlement was, and that would lead to a crisis in a few years. Wherever Chinese congregated in large groups, a camp would inevitably be established. With more than 500 men, the Lawrence Chinese camp in the central part of Otago was the largest of the 2 major Chinese mining areas. To the south was a camp called Round Hill, where about 300 Chinese lived. Each settlement had the bare bones elements of civilization: a hotel, merchant shops, and a temple. The men slept in tents, ramshackle lean-tos, or under the stars. Most Chinese miners reworked tailings left behind by European miners who were now digging on the west side of the island. They constructed networks of races, flumes, and sluices, closely coordinating with other men, usually from their clan or from the same home village. And like they did in California and surely elsewhere, they pooled capital, shared tools, looked after each other, and defended the group when threats came knocking. Their frugality and willingness to labor long hours on low-yield spots made them economically viable, whereas others had already given up and moved elsewhere. Just like the Chinese in California and other places in the U.S. and Canada, the Chinese were willing to work harder, longer, and for less. Same in the 1980s, I guess you could say, when reform and opening began. America had men like Norman Ah Sing to serve as their community leaders and advocates. So it was in New Zealand with Choie Sew Hoy. He was one of the most successful Chinese merchants and was admired and respected not only by his fellow Chinese, but by the local New Zealand community as well. He ran storehouses, supplied mining equipment, operated transport routes, and most importantly, perhaps, he served as kind of an unofficial credit union to the Chinese miners, offering supplies, letters from home, and remittances back to their villages in southern Guangdong. His office building at 29 Stafford Street, built in 1894, is still standing in Dunedin. There's a sign on the building saying Zhao Kai Yazhou Shiping Chao Shi, or Sew Hoy Oriental Food Market. Choie Sew Hoy was more than just a community leader and merchant. He was an inventor as well and devised new ways to dredge for gold. Yeah, that's how they did it. They dredged. You've seen it in movies before. These men squatted along the riverbank, scooping up gravel, washing it, seeing if anything in that pan glittered in the screens and riffles. And then it was thrown back into the riverbed. They panned, they sluiced, and when the technology was devised, they engaged in mechanized dredging. There's something that Choie Sew Hoy introduced in the mid-1880s, and his innovation of a kind of mechanized bucket dredge was called the Sew Hoy dredge, and it became the forerunner to later industrial-scale gold extraction machines in New Zealand. Yeah, and all the Chinese were as welcome in New Zealand as they were anywhere. They had to be vigilant all the time, but they still faced occasional beatings, robberies, destruction of property, and the usual claim jumping by others. Unlike what we know about the Chinese immigrant experience in California, New Zealand's history lacked the scale of violence and massacres witnessed in the American West. Wherever the races mingled, some degree of violence never failed to occur. But unlike the American West, in New Zealand, the problem there was sporadic rather than systemic. The anti-Chinese sentiment was manifested through legislation pushed through Parliament rather than being mob-driven by men like California's Dennis Kearney, who led the charge against Chinese immigration there. New Zealand had a prime minister, though, Richard Seddon. He served from 1893 to 1906. He was no friend of the Chinese, but never did he ever resort to the kind of 1870s California-style demagoguery meant to turn public sentiment against the Chinese immigrants. Instead of beating down the Chinese with their fists and guns, the New Zealand way was to rely on legal channels and poll taxes to discriminate against these unwelcome guests to their shores. The Chinese, by necessity, and perhaps by choice as well, were marginalized in the communities they lived in or near. While the New Zealand way meant less violence in the streets, the Chinese still had to endure the old selective law enforcement trick. Their enemy wasn't so much the lynch mobs as much as existing laws on the books that made things harder for them than for others. This kind of dynamic opened the door to men like Choie Sew Hoy. Someone had to take care of this Chinese community. In California, they had the 6 companies. In New Zealand, there was a Cheongsing Tong. In Mandarin, this was the Changsheng Tang. This organization headquartered in Dunedin, aside from acting in a similar capacity as most Chinese benevolent associations, was responsible for exhuming and repatriating the remains of deceased Chinese miners. Back in the mid-1860s and 70s, New Zealand, they rolled out the welcome mat for the Chinese and couldn't say enough good things about them. But like it was in America, by the late 1870s and into the 1880s, the mood had soured. Chinese in New Zealand went from being a bunch of nice guys into economic competitors. The same accusations were made against them as in the U.S. and elsewhere. Undercutting wages and repatriating wealth to China were gripes that were also made in New Zealand. And the more racist among the local citizens never failed to resort to claims of Chinese refusal to assimilate, being too clannish, opium smokers, carriers of disease, and acting like moral reprobates. In 1881, anti-Chinese sentiment in New Zealand reached the point where the government instituted the Chinese Immigration Act of 1881. Among its provisions were a prohibitive and racially targeted poll tax on the Chinese. 15 years later, that figure was upped from 10 to 100 pounds. Besides the 10-pound poll tax, vessels sailing to New Zealand ports were limited to one single Chinese immigrant per 10 tons of cargo. In 1896, this ratio went from one Chinese immigrant to 200 tons of cargo. And this law stayed on the books till 1944. And then 58 years after it was repealed, then New Zealand Prime Minister Helen Clark issued a formal apology to New Zealand's Chinese. So the Choie Sew Hoy was the refuge where these miners and laborers sought relief and redress of grievances. The Six Companies in San Francisco wasn't so much a merchant guild as much as it was a mutual aid and protection society. They went to bat for the Chinese laborers whenever the big, meaty fist of the government came down hard on them. Among the miners themselves, there were fights and disputes. The Choie Sew Hoy acted as the law courts. They mediated between the disputants in all manners of debts and any kind of legal argument. A Chinese miner in New Zealand wouldn't have any better luck in the hostile New Zealand courts than his counterpart in California would have. If someone got sick or injured and died as a result, the Choie Sew Hoy stepped up and filled these critical and necessary roles for all these men so far from their towns and villages. There was very little that was more profoundly important to the departed than to be reunited with their ancestors through burial in Chinese soil. If these men couldn't be buried in their guxiang, their ancestral villages, how can their descendants care for them properly and venerate them and tend to their graves on the Qingming festival? In his capacity as head of the Choie Sew Hoy, Choie Sew Hoy had previously, in 1883, carried out one of these repatriation missions. 233 Chinese who had perished in New Zealand were returned to the motherland. And now, another one of these missions was being organized. From 1901 to 1902, Chinese who had previously perished in New Zealand and who were interred in about 40 small Chinese cemeteries from around Dunedin had their remains exhumed and processed in such a way that each complete set of human remains was separated and bagged with an identification tag. And the remains were then placed inside a plain wooden coffin. And on July 22, 1901, while preparations were underway to process the remains for their final trip home to Guangdong province via Hong Kong, Choie Sew Hoy suddenly died, age 64. His son, Choie Sew stepped into his father's shoes and took over the operation. In total, there were 499 men who were prepared for the voyage home. They were scheduled to set sail for Hong Kong on a ship called the SS Ventnor. In 1902, the vessel was only a couple years old. It was built in Glasgow and was 393 feet long. The Choie Sew Hoy chartered the vessel and loaded the 499 coffins into the cargo hold, including the remains of Choie Sew Hoy. Most of the men, but not all, had come from Panyu and Hua County. In addition to the departed, there were a handful of elders who, accompanied the remains and watched over them on this final journey home. On October 26, 1902, the vessel left Westport and sailed up the west coast of the South Island to Wellington, the capital of New Zealand, named for the victorious general at the 1815 Battle of Waterloo. The next day, on October 27th, the SS Ventnor, sailing closer to the shore than it should have, hit rocks off the coast of Taranaki on the western side of the North Island. The ship's fate was sealed when the captain made the fatal mistake of seeking harbor in New Plymouth rather than turning around and heading south back to Wellington. Like that iceberg would do to the Titanic a decade later, the damage these rocks did to the Ventnor ended up being more catastrophic than Captain James Ferry at first determined. He was betting he could make it to Auckland to the north. That was the direction the vessel was heading anyway. Why turn around and sail back to Wellington? It was determined later that whilst piloting the vessel, Captain Ferry had enjoyed more than one tipple. The hull had been damaged and water started making its way into the compartments. Captain Ferry kept the pumps running and continued steaming in the direction of Auckland. Despite the severity of the damage, they were able to slowly make it up the coast in a northerly direction. But as the ship began to sink, it listed. That is to say, it leaned to one side rather than sitting up straight. And this caused cargo to shift, including a lot of coal. Emergency salvage procedures continued to be carried out. 4 lifeboats containing the crew and passengers tried to make it to safety, but only 3 survived and reached the shore at Omaperi, a settlement on the south shore of Hokianga Harbor in Northland. The Ventnor took on more water than it could pump out and ended up sinking off Hokianga Heads at 9 p.m. on October 29, 1902. Hokianga is almost but not quite at the tippy-top northernmost point of New Zealand. 13 people perished that day, including the captain and 7 other crew members. As for Choie Sew Hoy and his fellow Chinese, they got to die a second time. And the shipping manifest that identified every single one of these souls went down with the ship, adding to the impossibility of ever identifying everyone. The previous day, on the afternoon of October 28th, Captain Ferry had made the call to abandon ship. And not long after that, the SS Ventnor sank bow first down to the bottom of the sea. The remains of these Chinese who had come to New Zealand with their hopes and aspirations would never make it back home. November 21st, 1902, an inquiry determined that the striking of the rocks off Camp Egmont was due either to negligence or incompetence on the part of the captain. Drunkenness, while possible, could not be proven. No blame was assigned to the decision to keep going towards Auckland instead of turning back to Wellington. But many of the coffins, including that of Choie Sew Hoy, were lead-lined and ensconced in the hold. But there were also some coffins placed that had been stowed on deck that were plain wood and not lined with lead. Everything on and inside this vessel sank to the bottom of the sea. Then, some weeks later, off the Hokianga coast, some of these coffins and bags filled with human bones began washing up on the shore. A couple of the local iwi of Teroa and Teirawa began observing these objects. They kept washing ashore over a period of the next few months, and these plain wooden coffins that happened to have been stored on the deck floated to the surface and washed ashore. These coffins were actually a late addition to the cargo manifest, and they contained the remains of 10 men from Zhongshan County. These were the coffins that most likely were the ones that washed ashore south of the Hokianga Heads. The Cheongsing Tong had hired the steamer Energy from Auckland to try and locate the wreck and recover as many of the coffins as possible. Choi Poi was especially keen to locate the ship as the remains of his father, Choie Sew Hoy, were on the Ventnor. Unfortunately, the search was not successful. The Cheongsing Tong had placed the lead-lined coffins beneath decks, and it was assumed they all went down with the ship. The Maori people hold dear the term mana, It means authority or one's spiritual power. Your mana was someone's standing and authority within the group. And over a lifetime, you earned spiritual power through your ancestry and your actions. And of course, much more than that. One's mana existed only if it was recognized by others. There was also a concept they called Kaitia Kitanga. If mana created responsibility for people, it was Kaitia Kitanga that dictated how one acted in fulfilling these responsibilities for people, and not just for those of Maori ancestry. It was a word that defined the Maori principle of guardianship, stewardship, and the intergenerational responsibility towards the natural and spiritual world. The word expresses the obligation of people, tangata, to care for the land, the waters, forests, and living beings, not as owners, but as caretakers acting on behalf of ancestors and descendants yet to be born. The Maori of these iwi along that stretch of the west coast of the North Island, they knew what this was all about, and so they did what came natural. To the Maori, the dead, regardless of their origin or whoever they may have been in life, should be treated with dignity. There are a couple principles in the Maori communities that are pretty central in that culture. So, in the spirit of Kaitia Kitanga, the people there gathered the bones that kept washing up on the shoreline over a period of months, took them inland, and buried them with respect, performing their own Maori rites of returning them to the earth from whence they had once come, to ensure the spirits would not wander. In the Chinese tradition, these wandering spirits were called hungry ghosts, or ugwe. As things turned out, the Maori and Chinese people had a few other things in common. Before the sinking of the Ventnor in 1902, Maori and Chinese communities in New Zealand had little interaction. Both groups were, for all intents and purposes, marginalized within a European colonial system. And in the racial hierarchy of the day, both communities were mostly excluded from the political process. Perhaps at that time, from more than a century ago, the Maori people might not have been aware of the similarities they had with these mystery people, whoever they had once been, whose bones they had buried in their own cemeteries with all their rituals. Both people, Maori and Chinese, worshipped and honored their ancestors. And there was a strong belief that you were who you came from. Both had very strong clan associations and ties to their native places. The Maori with their iwi, hapu, and wanau extended families. The Chinese had their zongzu, the Chinese creation story of Pangu, and the Maori version, very similar. And both cultures had dragons and serpentine-like creatures as guardians, and they both prayed at sacred natural sites and had similar protocols for speaking, rituals, and other formalities. And both the Chinese and the Maori have produced many warriors among their communities. When these human remains washed ashore along the Hokianga coast, the Maori communities had no legal obligation to do anything. Nobody asked them to deal with this, and no one had a clue as to the identity of these remains. Despite all that, the Maori from these iwi, they recognized these were human remains, and therefore, in their world, tupapaku. This is a formal term for a dead body. And in the Maori culture, the tupapaku was sacred. And the dead possess mana, and those who are alive must exercise the obligations that Kaitia Kitanga called for, even though there was no shared language, ethnicity, or religious beliefs. These men who had come to New Zealand in the 1860s and 70s were adopted by these iwi, and their spirits never made it home to the western Pearl River Delta region of Guangdong Province. Instead, they commingled with the spirits of the land of Aotearoa. The cultural bridges that existed between the Maori and the Chinese weren't based on any beliefs or past experience. Their bond was in the moral priorities they shared. The Maori from these iwi did what they did without any expectation of reciprocity, and they could have just buried them and forgot about them, but for more than a century, they acted as the guardians of this site and maintained them, and
These stories that started to be told as early as 1903 included these Tupapaku who washed up on their shores. There were 2 known burial sites in the Waipoua forest area and at Miti Miti, where the Te Roroa and Te Rarawa had their burial grounds. Both sites have memorial plaques from the descendants of these Chinese in honor of the dead and thanking these 2 iwi for their care throughout the generations. It was only in 2004 that Maori elders shared their oral histories for the first time. And the stories that told of their grandparents and great-grandparents and how they had buried the bones, how they had felt a kinship with these Chinese miners who, like the Maori, valued their ancestral connection so deeply. While its general location was known, divers only located the wreck of the SS Ventnor in 2012. In 2013, descendants of Chinese miners and members from the Maori iwi gathered at Hokianga for a ceremony. And since then, annual remembrance events have been held. And these 2 cultures, these 2 communities who throughout history remained strangers, now join together to annually commemorate this event and honor these Chinese who came to New Zealand filled with hopes and dreams. The tragedy of the SS Ventnor became a bridge, a powerful connection between Chinese New Zealanders and the Maori who cared for their dead, performing the rites and rituals that their clan members in their home villages in Guangdong were unable to carry out for them. And it was the descendants of Choie Sew Hoy, in particular, who have helped to bring the story of the SS Ventnor back into public view. And they've led the efforts to reach out to the Maori and to lead the 2 people in remembrance of what happened and how this tied their 2 communities in the first place. The sinking of the SS Ventnor in 1902, aside from the tragedy, gives us a window to look at how these different societies treat their dead and how different cultures respond to strangers in their midst. In this episode, I wanted to give you an example of how one people on this planet that we all share, how they responded. And you could be sure that when the Chinese descendants and the family of Choie Sew Hoy finally learned about what had happened, they felt quite a profound degree of gratitude, not only for gathering up the remains and returning them to the earth, but for caring for them and carrying out their own rituals that at their most basic level were one and the same with what might have been performed during the Qingming festival. So there's no great battle or great emperor or profound discovery here. This is just a little story that perhaps teaches us that amidst the backdrop of history, quiet acts of humanity and compassion were going on all the time, all over the world. We just didn't see it, and nobody wrote a book about it. So that's going to be it for now. I'll have a few links to videos and documentaries that cover this subject in more detail. A big shout out to David M. in Beijing, flying the New Zealand flag there since the 1980s, and I'm proud to say, one of my biggest supporters going back to the days when the CHP wasn't even half as good as it is today. Thank you, David. And another shout out to John R. in Taiwan, the Formosa Files guy. Yeah, that's right. Born and raised in New Zealand. And to all my Kiwi listeners, wherever you are in the world, thanks for all your support all these years, suffering through the China History podcast like you did. Well, I'm going to go get my Split Ends, Crowded House, and Neil Finn records and stack them on my record player and enjoy all that good stuff for the rest of the day. Besides the whole Lord of the Rings thing, kiwi fruit, fine wines, rugby, and gorgeous scenery, having Neil Finn as part of your team, that's some serious soft power New Zealand is packing. Okay, that's going to be all I got for you this time. This is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from Los Angeles. Thanks for listening, and on behalf of the group and ourselves, I hope we pass the audition. Join me next time, won't you, for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.